Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Association of Research Libraries on the Edge. I'm Sue Boffman and pleased to welcome you to our program today. I'm pleased to introduce Torsten Reimer, Head of Research Services at the British Library, who's leading this presentation and discussion on research libraries in 2030. This is a timely topic on what research libraries might look like in 10 years into the future, as we just reach 2020. We are recording this session and we'll put a copy of the recording on ARL's website following next week's session. As I've reminded you as you joined us, we'd like you to mute your video and audio until you're ready to contribute to the discussion or ask a question. We will use the chat box to help us identify who would like to join in. And Torsten welcomes questions during his presentation, and there will be plenty of time at the end for discussion with all of you. So again, welcome. Thank you, Torsten, for being with us, and I'll turn things over to you now.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Happy New Year to everyone. What I should say in advance that you're today getting 2 for 1 because I've effectively brought 2 presentations. That means I'll have quite a lot of material, and I might therefore, when I go through it, speak about a few things maybe more briefly, and then we can, if there's an interest, go in more detail later. So as Sue said, I'm also happy to take questions in between. If something comes up and you have a burning questions or comment, then feel free to raise it in the chat, and then Sue will point me to it if I miss it. Maybe before I go into the presentation, just a few words about myself to give you a bit of a sense for my background, because that I think quite heavily influences my view on research libraries in the next decade. I've come into this as an academic from digital humanities, and I've worked in a range of roles, both in the HE sector, but also not-for-profit sector, for example, working at JISC, the digital service provider for libraries in the UK, and others. In my current role in the British Library, it's very much in 2 parts. It's partly thinking about the future of research services and what the library, as a research library, the British Library has a much broader remit, but what it as a research library wants to be in 5 or 10 years from now, but also looking at relatively large operational remit that's about all the content that we bring into the library and then make available for our users. So I'm going to share my slides in a few seconds, so bear with me while I look distracted for a moment to bring up the slides. And I hope you can now all see my screen. So this presentation is really inspired a lot by the work that I'm currently doing. If I'm sort of charged with my team to develop and help develop new services for the British Library, then we need to have an idea of what the library environment might look like 20 years from now. And so in the following, I want to reflect a little bit on the challenges that we currently face as research libraries, talk about what's often presented as maybe a new paradigm for how research libraries could work or operate. And then I want to sort of take that apart and challenge it, and maybe share a few of the concerns I have about challenges that we have over the next decade. And then towards the end, talk a bit about what we are doing at the British Library to prepare ourselves for the next decade. Now, to start with, I'll sort of take us back for a brief moment into the past. That's a past that maybe never exactly existed in the same way. But broadly speaking, a while ago, you had a library and it was a building. It looked a bit prettier than what I've been able to design in PowerPoint. And in that building, you had a library collection. And if you are a large research library, like, for example, the British Library, according to some metrics, you can argue this different ways. We are the largest library in the world if you look at holdings or certain parts of holdings. But either way, if you are a sizable library, then I think a while ago your thinking may have been very much like it's reflected here. You have a library collection, and yes, there is other content around it that your users want, but the bulk of what your users might want, you might be able to serve them in that building. That's obviously not where we are now. And in fact, even for a very large library like the British Library, collections now look very different. If we think about what our users want, then our collections that we have here are arguably a shrinking part of what we can offer. There's more material that we can point to, that we maybe have licensed, and there's a growing world of open access and open content on the web. And you could go so far to say that certainly in our case, our collections are still growing, but relative to content out there that's growing exponentially on the internet, our collections are shrinking. And that means that we can no longer hope, if we ever really had that hope, to meet all user needs from our own collections. That means we need to sort of more and more rethink what our collections do. And a key aspect of this is, I think, we have to start thinking about enhancing our collections by very actively connecting them to relevant global content. And you can, in fact, envisage a library now that has very little or no content. But you also need to think about this library, I think, much more in an open and open science world, in particular in a research context. Research is increasingly global, where content is global. And in particular, from the perspective of a national library, the idea of a national collection or any type of closed collection, I don't think doesn't quite work in the same way as you could maybe think about this 30, 40, or even 50 years ago. This is only part of a wider set of challenges that we face, and I could talk about this for a long time. You all be familiar with them from your different perspectives, but I wanted to highlight a few key things, which is the research environment is increasingly digital. Even for disciplines like mine, I used to be a historian, I think arguably digital is important and is more important than I think many of our library services do fully reflect this. If you consider, in particular in the sciences, how very much computational driven that is, and that isn't really reflected, certainly not broadly, in the research library environment. But it goes further. You can say traditionally, research libraries were here for discovery of content and access to content. But if you think about the role that Google has, and Google is now, and that research has shown us this for quite a while, the #1 point where people start their research. There are others like Wikipedia. But increasingly, people expect to find content online, find it really quickly, and not go very far. And our provision for content doesn't necessarily match this. And you could arguably, with some services, in particular if you're willing to use some services that maybe aren't entirely legal, effectively do your whole discovery and access of research outside of libraries. So what's our role in there? And how is the issue that we struggle to afford content playing into this? If we find it increasingly difficult to license and buy all the content that our users want, and they increasingly find the content online, what's invisible and less used? Now, partly you could say this is all fine. There's the open science agenda and open access. We don't need to buy as much content. There's more content openly available online. But again, this is content that our users don't necessarily need us to access. And while this whole environment is changing, we also increasingly see that what people want from a library service on site in the buildings is changing, because the number of people who exclusively want a desk in a quiet environment where they can read books or even digital material is shrinking, and we see different use of our spaces. And that's also something that we need to consider. So what could a new paradigm now look like? And arguably, I think certainly in the UK, a very broadly held view is, well, we might not end up buying content or licensing content anymore. We'll just help our users publish their own content in an open science world. We'll effectively focus shift somewhat from a collections paradigm to a services paradigm that sits in an open environment. And that's something that libraries are already using, moving towards. If you look at open access transformation, certainly in the UK, but in other countries with strong open access policies, libraries provide more and more open access services, pay article processing charges. And you can see other industries who can't sell content anymore, but sell sort of value-added services. That's sort of a widely held view, and what I now want to do in the following is challenge that view a little bit and say, will this really hold up 10 years from now? And so what I want to outline now is what a research library, knowledge library environment could look like in 2030. My first assumption here is going to be that by 2030, the debate about will this be open access or not will be broadly over. This arguably might look somewhat different from a US perspective than a UK perspective, because we've had much stronger mandates for open access than almost any other country. But considering the large amount of global open access content, let's just make the assumption we have won, I think, something that many librarians wanted for a long time, which is everyone can have access to knowledge has been achieved. So it should be a good thing, but it poses, I would argue, some challenges for libraries and brings up the question, what's our role in there? For example, if you look at the key open access services, I've picked one up here on Paywall, which I think many of you will be familiar with, is arguably the largest open access discovery service that we have globally, certainly in terms of having an API that's also now used by publishers. We see open access button and other services, core in the UK, based in Germany, who are key for open access discovery. Some of them are run by libraries, but the bulk isn't. And you could argue that for discovery and access to open content, maybe these services are enough and libraries aren't needed anymore. You might then say, well, fair enough, but we can provide publishing infrastructure, we can pay article processing charges, and libraries are doing this already, and they may well still be doing it in 10 years' time. But when I look at the future in open access particularly, I tend to look at the Wellcome Trust in the UK, who seems to always be a few years ahead of other funders, and they recently launched Wellcome Open Research, and they now have a publishing platform on their own. Now, if I were a funder, and I would look at challenges getting publishers to move to open access, if I would look at inefficiency of article processing charging models like there are in the UK, I might well decide to just tell my researchers, you have to publish on our own publishing platform. I don't want to say this is necessarily going to be the outcome, that everything will be on the platforms of research funders, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a move where the open access environment is much more dominated by either services such as on Paywall, and it brings up the question, what value can we add as research libraries in this space, or will we just simply point our users to those services? Pointing our users to services brings up to another topic that's very close to my heart, persistent identifiers. We at the British Library are involved in a European funded project called Freya that has many of the sort of persistent identifier infrastructure providers globally involved. So there are organizations like DataCite, for example, involved in this, but also large research organizations. And we're all working together to increase the uptake of persistent identifiers like ORCID, and that's generally a good thing because it means better metadata and more connection between content. Now, while this sounds good, it also brings up a question about the role of libraries. These identifiers work particularly well if they're embedded in any digital object when the object is created. So you run an experiment, and the software that you use or the facility that you have will create your data, and ideally also add some key persistent identifiers like your ORCID and other things right in there. That's what you want because you get the best data quality. But if this is what we're getting, and that data creation tends to happen outside of libraries, then what we'll find is that there's a whole set of metadata being created that lives with a few service providers globally, and will arguably become so big that no single library could really download it all, nor would you want to, because if it has live connections, it's most valuable. So there will be something coming up which is more and better metadata created early on, which librarians would normally regard as a good thing. But arguably, metadata creation in this environment also might move increasingly out of libraries. And one of the areas that we consider to be a core task of librarians might happen in a very different way to how it's done currently. You can take this further and look at open science more broadly. And if you look at the requirements that we have, say, building large-scale data infrastructures, repositories, many libraries struggle. We just a while ago asked repository managers in the UK, and they came up with a long list of issues, and not being able to fully support their repository systems, to update them, having older versions of software that someone customized 5 years ago and that you can't really quite easily move to the next version. Arguably, we're already struggling managing our repositories well, and I can also speak about the British Library. We have some old systems that we really urgently need to upgrade, but don't always have the resource to do this. So the question is, if we want to be a player in supporting open science, do we actually have the skill set and the capacity and the technology to do this actively? This becomes even more challenging if you think about user interfaces. Currently, I think as libraries, we very much think about people. People come to us, use our catalog. This is now online, no longer a catalog for most items. But I wonder if 10 years from now, people will be the #1 user interface that we have to think about, or whether our interfaces will increasingly be for software. If I'm a researcher, I don't necessarily want to have to go to different library catalogs. What I want is to pick up my phone in the morning and say, I want all data sets that have a positive correlation between this virus and this particular compound. Then I want to cycle into work, and when I'm there, I want all the data to be on my desktop because I've asked my digital assistant to pull this together. So arguably, we need to open our systems up much more to being queried by other systems who then serve that content to our users, which means the users are moving further away from us in this scenario. And currently, many of us are not really set up to actually understand how we can develop these systems, which means we become increasingly reliant, arguably, on systems providers and on also then increasingly technologies from the world of artificial intelligence. Doesn't have to be quite as threatening as in a certain sci-fi film that I've used for this image. But arguably, artificial intelligence technologies will have to play a critical role, big data analytics, for example, and others, in working on content. So that means our content will increasingly be managed by algorithms that we have to buy in because we don't have the knowledge to build them ourselves, nor the capacity. But we will possibly no longer understand how our systems work. And if you ask yourself, do you already at this point fully understand how your discovery system prioritizes content? I mean, maybe you do. Will this still be the case in 5 or 10 years from now? I'm not so sure. So there's also a bit about trust that's potentially going to go missing if we can't fully explain to our users why we are serving them the content, that kind of personalized, much better pulled together content that they're looking for and that we want to serve them. But we might not fully understand how this happens. Now, interestingly, there are organizations out there who invest a lot of money into this. I, a little while ago, took this screenshot from the Elsevier website. And many of us, I think of organizations like Elsevier as publishers. But if you read what it says here, it says Elsevier is a global information analytics business. That's how they describe themselves now. And many of the larger publishers are moving into an environment where what they're going to sell us might no longer be the content, but it might be discovery and analytics features. So we could find ourselves in an environment where already having concerns maybe about market concentration and a small number of organizations controlling it, that number of organizations could become even smaller. Whereas if you look around in the digital space, look at Google, look at Amazon, digital in our current economic environment often leads to market concentration. So we might find a smaller number of providers, less choice, who control algorithms that we don't understand, but that we depend on. And that's something that we actively need to engage with. Now, you might say, well, this is all fine, but we work in a library that has special collections that you can only get with us, and that gives us something unique. And certainly from the British Library perspective, I would argue that we are one of those libraries. But then when you think about it, what we want to do generally with special collections is digitize them, share them online, make sure that more and more people can have access to them. And we certainly strive to make more and more content available open online with licenses that allow reuse. That also means sharing, and it means others can harvest our content. For example, you can look at the Internet Archive, and you can find early modern manuscripts there. You can find medieval illuminated manuscripts on there. The interesting question is, we could also find that the more we digitize our special collections, others will be better than we are at building some kind of overlay through which you can connect that content and use it. So an area where we currently probably think users will always want to come to us, the more we succeed, the more we make that content available, we have to ask ourselves, what value can we add? And will users still recognize that this content is actually coming over from us? Now, thankfully, in a different environment, I think things are much easier, which is looking at the physical spaces. I think a while ago, there were some concerns that in a digital environment, nobody would want to come to libraries as the physical buildings. At least I've heard this for a while, and I would imagine some of you have as well. If your reading rooms are anything like ours, it's very easy to say that's not true. And in fact, we are, and many HE libraries in the UK are now actually making efforts to work more with their local communities and also recognize that being in a certain space and supporting a community is useful. So we have people who want to use our spaces. We have local communities that we can work with, but that still requires us to rethink the way how we support people in those spaces, in particular in a more and more digital environment where they aren't necessarily come to see our collections. We need to rethink what our spaces mean and how they can keep adding value to what our users do. Another area where library skills and experience are already sort of sought after is in the wider space of digital skills and digital literacy, and also broadly thinking about inclusion as particularly relevant for research libraries that, like the British Library, are open for the public, or at least a wider cross-section of the public, but also has relevance for universities and higher education libraries, just maybe in a slightly different way. And that, I would actually argue, is a role that's important and is likely to become more important by helping to enable people to work with knowledge, even if that knowledge might no longer come from our collections. While that's, I think, a positive role that we can play, I think we have to ask ourselves, how can we do this? And do we really have the skills across our teams, across staff, that we can actually support that kind of growing user demand? And how do we have to prepare ourselves in the next few years to prepare our staff to be able to do that? So taking a step back at this moment and briefly summarizing that, how could this new paradigm of us becoming more open science service providers work out? I think there are quite a few risks. In particular, I think, not wanting to speak to every single bullet point here, but in particular, I'm concerned is if we move into an environment where instead of having things ourselves, we procure and license services and content that live out in the cloud and are being processed in the cloud and are being provided by a small number of service providers, then we need to be able to become much more than we are now specialists in procuring content. Part of our, not just content, but specialists in procuring services. We have lots of experience, obviously, in procuring content. But we'll see a shift. We might not find it as easy as we assume to become open science service providers, because there'll be very shiny things pushed by companies who have orders of magnitude more money than we do. And we need to think carefully about what role can we play in all of this. We probably find that there will be more automation, so there will be financial pressure on us to reduce our staffing budgets, but we might also not need quite as many staff, at least not in traditional roles. But are we actually set up? Do we have the training to really manage that transition from, in some areas, a very sort of workflow procedural way of working to one that will require, I think, even more educated staff than we have in some areas? Where we need skills like data science that we find difficult currently to recruit because others can pay a lot more. So I am sometimes wondering, will we really largely be a digital information service provider, or might we have to focus much more on the aspect of enabling humans that will make the physical connections in some ways more important than maybe some people who somewhat naively looked at libraries a few years ago maybe thought. So these are some of my concerns. And what I now want to do, sort of wrapping up, is talk you through a little bit what we're doing at the British Library to prepare us for this. And then I would be, after that, really interested to have your thoughts. And in particular, hopefully also some criticism on my maybe somewhat too pessimistic view of libraries. I am, I would say, not overly pessimistic, otherwise I wouldn't be in the job that I'm currently in. And so we're trying to position the British Library so that we think we can still be usefully adding value to researchers in 10 years' time. I'll be doing this. We have a strategy that currently goes until 2023, or strategic vision. It's called Living Knowledge, and it has this ambition for us to be the most open, creative, and innovative institution of our kind in the world. To enable us to do this, we have a service strategy for research, which we've developed over the last couple of years, and we are currently in the process of refreshing our content strategy. And I've added a link here to an article I wrote a little while ago that sort of highlights some key points about our service strategy. And to implement both of those, we have a strategic change management portfolio that's helpfully called Everything Available. And not all, but quite a few of the things that I'll now highlight come out of that change management portfolio. But before going into this, I want to highlight that a key thing that we're doing is putting more effort in understanding our users. So I set up a dedicated post in my team for Research Services Insight Manager, who's coordinating our user research for our research audience. And we are running a program of user research that includes quite a few elements: understanding non-users, understanding our total audience, because we have cultural visitors, business visitors, we work with schools and others. We're doing on-site research in our reading rooms and public areas, including observations of people. We have ongoing user satisfaction snapshot surveys, and we've also commissioned some research into how people discover content. Talking about the user research in itself could easily fill an hour, so I'll only want to highlight a few points, and I'll mostly focus on online services. But to start with, something about our on-site users is, even at the British Library, a place where you might imagine people come to and travel from all over the world to see our collections, a not insignificant part of our users on any given day is actually not using our material. This is a snapshot, but I believe it's broadly correct. On a given day, you might find in our reading rooms about 60% of people work with our collections. 20% roughly might not at the moment work on our collections, and 20% work in this environment and are not interested in our collection at all. And I think that percentage is growing. What most people are looking for is a technology-enabled workspace in a sort of library type environment that's focused and quiet. But what we also have here from our users is they want to do much more computational research on our collections. At least the digital humanities crowd want to do that. And there's also strong interest in the library space as a more interdisciplinary space where researchers can come together and build bridges and develop new contacts. There is a different expectation to what our whole facilities were designed for, which is bringing books onto readers' desks. If we look at non-users, this is based on a panel of over 1,000 people from across the UK asking, why are you not using us? And a key point that comes up is they are not aware. They either don't even think of us, or they are aware we exist, but don't necessarily come for us. And it clearly, I think what the research has shown us, perhaps not surprisingly, is people start their research online. Google is the most common starting point, and they'll only consider going to libraries if they feel they've exhausted what they do. They trust libraries, but they often believe that what they can find online is sort of good enough. And this is easier for university library, arguably, because they'll be much more aware that the university library exists. Students will know it, faculty will know it. But if it's not embedded in their online workflow, and if the collections of material that we have aren't instantly visible on Google, then there's a chance that they might not even come to us. There's much more here that's specific about the British Library, but being visible in whatever tools our users use, even those tools aren't ours, I think is critical for our success and certainly for our visibility in the longer run. What are we doing in terms of more practical terms in transforming the British Library? This change management portfolio that I've mentioned, everything available, has two programs. One is called Knowledge Spaces. The other, somewhat tentatively at the moment, called Open Library. Knowledge Spaces is about enhancing our on-site services, and Open Library is about enhancing our online services. And we keep these together in one portfolio because I don't want to end up in a position where our online services and our on-site services diverge and don't support the same goal. They need to sort of stay together. They are different in terms of how we achieve our aims, but need to be taken forward together, and that's what we are doing. I only briefly want to talk about knowledge spaces, but the key aim here is effectively making sure that we have much more flexible spaces that support multiple purposes. They need to be technology enabled. A particular challenge for us is that our users want to have all the content on their own device. And much of the collections that we have here for licensing and legal reasons, we can't currently make available, or we don't have the technology to do this securely. But we need to really think about how we have technology-enabled workspaces with the right AV facilities that people can do their work, but also how can we open these spaces up and be more open and inclusive. Currently, many people who hear about the British Library think of this as a space for middle-aged, middle-class, white people, and that's a disaster, frankly. We also see this in sort of our user pattern. We need to open this more and bring down the barriers and bring more people into more flexible open spaces that don't always smell of academic research in a traditional sense, but rather try and redefine us as sort of innovation spaces where we can bring, in our case, business, researchers, digital technology and information together. So that's the overall aim for what's going to be a very ambitious piece of work that we are undertaking. We're building for this on a range of previous work. One of those is British Library Labs. It's been running for quite a few years with Mellon Foundation. We are currently in the process of switching this over to becoming a core funded service, but it's having the capability and capacity that we can support researchers with advanced computational research on our collections and become a partner in their research. I think that's something that's really critical, that ensures that we stay up to date with skills, but also ensures that people come to us, not just because we have content, but also because we know how to conduct research on that content. We're quite lucky in that we have more capacity that we can build on. The UK, for a few years now, has the Alan Turing Institute. It's the National Centre for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence Research, and that's based in the British Library. They're a separate organization, but their offices are actually right physically under the room where I'm speaking. And what we're now starting to do now that they're set up is to work together more to see how we can leverage these technologies and how we can share what we've learned with other libraries, not wanting to leave artificial intelligence to purely close down commercial entities. So just as an example, we are running a project called Living with Machines that involves the Alan Turing Institute, us, but also universities. It's roughly £10 million investment. And it's looking at the impact of technology on people's lives, but not today, during the Industrial Revolution. and is built largely on digitized content from the British Library, census information, digitized books, newspapers in particular, really important. And what we're trying to do is see how far can we push machine learning and other technologies to pull information out of that content and link it. What can we learn, and what can we then share with other libraries and other knowledge organizations to help them master these technologies and see what is or what isn't suitable. We are also working with other innovators. In particular, I'm really keen for us to do something which is work with smaller organizations. Get the Research is a collaboration between us, our role is relatively small at the moment, and the startup, not-for-profit, that's set up on Paywall. And what they're working on is building an open access discovery interface that not just shows content, but aims to explain that content and is not aimed just at academic researchers, or might be, say, particularly useful for researchers who are looking for content that's not from their discipline. So what they're trying to do is, can they actually use machine learning to have sort of summaries and translations of content, or at least pull information from other sources like Wikipedia and else to directly help people understand and find the type of content that's most useful for them. If, for example, a member of your family has a rare disease, you probably don't want the latest specialized research that looks at just one aspect. You might want to have the latest meta study that gives you an overview of this. And it's these kind of things that they're exploring. And when they've sort of crossed that first hurdle, then we want to work with them to expose this to our users, but also work with public libraries to see how this could be useful in public and other libraries. Speaking of public libraries, we are also working with the Arts Council, who in England fund public libraries, and the Carnegie Trust in the UK, to see, isn't there something where we can help public libraries to expand their digital services? This originally was called Single Digital Presence for Public Libraries, but will probably get a new name in the next phase. This is not us building a single thing that will then magically solve all issues for public libraries, but rather thinking about what would help public library users. What can public libraries not do on their own because they are too small? Is there a way for the British Library, but also research libraries and others, to come together and find better ways, for example, of how we can point users to content? If your public library doesn't have what you want, wouldn't you want to know that the university library next door has that content and that it's maybe willing to let you see it? I would find this really interesting in opening up universities more to the public and building more links between libraries. And so that's what we're currently thinking about. What is actually genuinely useful for users? What could be done? And is this something that, instead of leaving to commercial entities, trusted public organizations like the British Library could have a role to work in partnership and help us build an open infrastructure that really helps our users? We, of course, need to do the same for us. Our content is currently spread out over a range of different platforms. Not all our digital content is accessible in the way that we want. So we have this aim to actually, for the first time, make all our content discoverable, make it visible to humans in a way that's much better than our current 36 different separate specialized catalogs that we use. But better ways to highlight our content, for example, on Wikipedia, but also make more content available to machines. I've mentioned this before. I strongly believe we need to get our content out where our users are. We still want to make sure that it retains some level of link back and branding to the British Library, so they understand where it comes from and they see that we still have a function. But sitting here and assuming that people will always want to come to our catalog is not something I'm comfortable with. So it's repackaging our content in different ways and moving towards a platform where, for the first time, we really have a good user experience for showcasing the many dozens of millions of items that we have, and opening them up to more people is an ambitious project. It will take quite a while, but it's something we are working on. To do this, we need to effectively change our whole infrastructure. We are currently in the process of rebuilding our whole preservation and sort of content management system. We have petabyte scale content, way over 5 million items, what you could sort of call the part of a national collection that we look after. And while we are sort of building this new preservation layer, we are in the process of consolidating our separate repositories effectively into one access layer that would have different sort of logical repositories on them, so that we can move from multiple systems that are often out of date to one system that can serve multiple purposes. And as we've been thinking about this, we were approached by a few partner organizations, and we've just before Christmas launched a beta of our shared research repository. Currently with 5 other organizations. They're all at the moment cultural organizations like the British Museum or the Museum of London Archaeology, for example, but they all produce research outputs in their own right. So we now have the capability to very quickly spin up new repositories. And for those partners, we've built a shared layer where you can search content from all these organizations. When at some point we get other partners who are very, very different, then we might set up something differently. But we want to try and become a meaningful service provider and work in partnership with other organizations, because arguably none of us can really do this on our own. And we think openness is important enough to not let key infrastructure, or not let all key infrastructure, in the hand of commercial entities. And just to avoid any confusion, we are working with a commercial service provider, but we're clear that we wanted to own the content and actually also wanted to own the open source system on which this is run, so that we would have the flexibility at some point to move to another service provider if that's useful. And that's just been launched. It's still very much a beta version, but we're now looking to sort of expand this, hopefully bring more partners in, and if I'm allowed a short commercial interlude, we would also be more than happy to speak to organizations from outside the UK if they're interested in thinking about a shared open source platform to make research outputs more accessible and pool resources and do something that's bigger than we can do on our own. We are currently doing this in the UK. UK funders have just made roughly 20 million pounds available for an initiative called Towards the National Collection, which brings together a range of, in particular, cultural organizations from the UK, but also universities, to see if we can't link our collections more, and both through exhibitions and events in a very much physical space, but very much also through discovery access, persistent identifiers, technologies like IIIF and others, to finally sort of realize that promise of the digital age, that there aren't silos of collections sitting here and there, but there are ways for users to really discover and experience collections thematically, and not just by which organization happens to own them. So that's another initiative that we are currently focusing on with a range of projects to help sort of drive forward. And then finally, for all of these skills are absolutely critical, we're working on a new people strategy, as we call it at the British Library, where we want to think about how we can enable more staff to be engaged in these discussions. Again, we can't do this on our own. RL UK, the UK group of research libraries, has a digital shift working group, which I'm currently chairing. It's part of a wider digital scholarship network, and we are working on a manifesto that will help certainly inform our UK's activities on how over the next decade it can help research libraries to make that transition and be confidently able to work in the digital space. And there's a range of other activities. I just want to mention one that we're just about to kick off. It's called Transformation Through International Collaboration. We are partnering with the Dutch and Belgian national libraries to think about how we can enable our staff and also our leaders to be more active in that space. And while it's very much a national library initiative, we're going to share what we learn from this in the hope that others can reuse it. So a lot of this is about digital infrastructure, but arguably none of this can really take off if we don't have the skills and we don't master that digital transformation. So to wrap up, I think there are quite a few challenges. And again, I'm particularly concerned about we can't leave artificial intelligence exclusively to closed commercial approaches. I absolutely welcome commercial approaches in there, but in a library world, we need a level of openness and transparency to understand this. We need to have the staff, we might have fewer, but they need to be more highly skilled, and we need to think very carefully about how we can manage that transition. We need to think careful about how we can sort of keep adding value. We're probably not able to do much of technical development ourselves, but what we could do is together as a library community, rally around community infrastructures, and where we can't build our own, think very careful about what does an open environment have to look like? How can we run procurement such that we get solutions that don't move us into some of those problem spaces that I've described before? As we are more and more needing to collect things that we procure to meet our users, I think we need to absolutely do it and focus on meeting user expectations, but we also need to make sure that we retain that level of openness and trust. And we can't, I think, take the risk of just falling back and say, well, we have some collections that people always want to have. It's that trust, it's that transparency, it's being focused on our users, and is having staff that are trusted and skilled enough to support others. So that's maybe as a summary some of the issues that we need to look at and focus as a library community if I think we want to, in 10 years, still feel confident that we can add value to our users. And with that, I think it's over to you for questions and hopefully some interesting challenges.
Thank you, Torsten. If anyone would like to join in with a question or a comment, please unmute your audio and join in. We welcome that.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Bocher and I work at Georgetown University. And I wholeheartedly support everything you're saying. However, I do want to push back a little bit on the staffing needs and some of the learning that some librarians already have that they don't know that they could offer. I think one of the things that libraries, public as well as academic libraries, should be focusing on in the future is actually user-generated research, and that we are a trusted source for them to find information, which we've always had that role, but also our knowledge of publishing, our knowledge of content, our knowledge of output, and so I think that we should be offering services to students and researchers and anybody about how to write articles. Where do you publish those articles? What are the copyright issues about that materials? Not just articles, but videos, applications, internet's apps, whole apps. So I really do believe patrons as producers is a role that libraries should take on, because we trust our users to be able to express themselves, and that it also feeds into that we are seen as experts in publication and in content. And so I think that is just a natural role for us to go on to.
I agree with everything that you said. I think that is an important role. And previously, before I joined the British Library, I was at Imperial College in London. And that's certainly something that the library services do, and I think many library services have done. And I think in particular, as we are more and more in a transition of publishing, where many new journals come up, people are maybe uncertain about which open access journal you can trust, what kind of licensing agreement you should sign, where we have Plan S that wants researchers to retain copyright and all the complexity. I absolutely agree that there's a role. I've put the presentation together in the way partly responding to an assumption that libraries will necessarily run the open access infrastructure. So this is maybe somewhat more focused on that particular part because it's something I hear a lot. But the more I think about this, the more I think many libraries will not be able to do this, but I think all libraries should be able to help their users master this. And if we can do this well, I think our users will thank us, and it could be a more important role for libraries than it is now. I absolutely agree.
This is Jennifer again. There was another point I wanted to make about the role of librarians, and are important for subject librarians, particularly, that some library administration aren't seeing the role of subject librarians being needed because of the artificial intelligence and of the bots that are out there seeking information. That I do think there is a role for subject specialists within libraries that are able to put people's concepts so that they can structure their research queries better, so they can interpret the data, and that they could put things in context. That I don't think AI is there yet. AI is good at gathering, it's good at synthesizing, but unless you put your structure and your query together correctly, that it's just going to be a fire hose.
Yeah, AI is one of those topics where I think we can have confidence that there will be a very dramatic change, but equally, like many of those buzzwords, the change might not be quite what we're expecting. And I certainly don't think it's going to solve all our problems. I mean, one aspect that I'm really concerned about is the bias that's already evident in machine learning algorithms, because if you're being trained on data that's not right, or that has a bias, say against a certain race, then it turns out you cannot just make children biased through bad education, you can also make AI algorithms biased. So I think there is an important role for libraries in this space to be involved in the discussion on the ethics. And I think that will require understanding of our users, some subject expertise, understanding of the law, but also some understanding of AI. And there's also a role in helping users to work with them, because we aren't at that point yet. But I think there will be an increasing expectations that these algorithms will solve all problems. They may, perhaps, at some point, may not. But certainly for many years, as you rightly said, we aren't there. And therefore, we'll need staff to help users make the best use of these algorithms. But arguably, I think we can't just assume that we will have those staff naturally. We need to think about, I think, how we can help our staff get more exposure to these technologies, understand what the pros and cons are, and how they can really meaningfully advise people. So no, I don't think AI will make, certainly not in the near to mid-future, all librarians meaningless. But we need to have the skills to keep up and to support our users and to enable our users in the right way to make use of those technologies, and particularly in the transition phase when this will come up, and it will still be in relatively early stages and maybe a decade or two away from where we hope it will get to eventually.
I'd like to hear what discussions the British Library has had in regards to data storage demand, especially in regards to supporting repositories, local versus cloud, role of the British government in terms of supporting, institutional versus national repositories, and the British Library's role in that.
Yeah, this is a topic that we are very much discussing at the moment. So far, most things that we do, certainly user-facing things, are on-premise. And when I say on-premise, we work with other national libraries in the UK. So the Scottish National Library, for example. So we have a distributed system, our digital preservation asset management system, where we sort of replicate content between the different locations, partly because the other libraries, say National Library of Wales, want to give its users fast access to it, but also as disaster recovery means. We are looking at moving into the cloud, but I want to be very clear, that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to move everything into the cloud. I think it very much depends on the use case. One particular issue that's come up is cloud may look inexpensive, but depending on for what use case, it can be, while really flexible, become really, really expensive if you say you have a distributed system that constantly checks content to, say, run checksums across distributed content to work out, is every instance still fully intact? Do we need to copy content to heal some damaged content, etc.? So I think there are some interesting challenges for the cost. And also, I mean, broadly speaking, we're now launching this new repository, and we'll see how much content people will download. Currently, we offer this for free to our partners because they put effort into developing it with us. But eventually, we'll want to move to a model where everyone contributes to the cost. And we don't quite know yet how much traffic we have. That Access repository is actually fully cloud hosted at the moment, which gives us great flexibility and scalability. But it brings up the question of how much does it cost, how are our systems set up to make use of it, and also how far do we trust the cloud? Now, I've heard when I was in higher education, often the point made by researchers, I don't trust the cloud for my research data, and I thought, but your desktop that almost everyone can just walk into the building and walk out of the building with, is that more secure? I'm not sure it is. But arguably, if you're particularly looking at long-term preservation, it is a concern. So we are probably unlikely in the near future to move everything into the cloud. I would expect us that we'll keep some level of local copies, because we have a responsibility where if our content was in a cloud controlled by a foreign government that at some point might have some random views on providing services to other countries, and the British Library's content would disappear, that would not just be supremely awkward, it would be a disaster. So as a national library, we have that particular responsibility. I think cloud is a fantastic resource, but you want to look very carefully at what's the cost, what benefit do you get from your users. When you want scalability, then there's a high benefit. And are you confident that you can definitely get your content out in the way that you want? So I think the same applies to cloud than to many other types of contracts when you need to consider your content. As far as the UK government is concerned, there isn't any sort of policy on that sense, apart from them wanting cost-effective shared services. But we do have a few sort of crown data centers in the UK that have to meet certain requirements. And for us, that might be a potential route to use cloud services that are still very much UK-based. But it's under development, and we currently use a mix of different approaches. So it very much depends on the content, I would say.
Well, Torsten, we have reached the top of our hour, and I want to thank you very much for leading this discussion, and know that you'll be with us again with another group of colleagues next week. So we really appreciate that. I also want to thank all of our participants for joining us, and your participation as well. So thank you, Torsten, from the ARL Academy. We thank you very much, and I'd like to wish everyone to have a good day. So thank you for coming.
Well, and thank you very much for having me. And I just wanted to say, if there are any particular issues that you want to have further information on, or maybe challenges where you think we want to do something about this, feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to work with other partners who want to do something positive in this space. So thank you again very much for having me today.
All right, thank you.